Welcome to I Told My Story YouTube channel. I'm Emily. The day my mother passed away from illness, I knew my life was about to change. As I stood by her grave at the funeral, I bid her farewell with tears streaming down my face. My stepfather, John, approached beside me. He leaned in and spoke coldly into my ear. Now that your mother's gone, you should look for a job after school. We need money to support the household, he said. I was stunned. I never thought John could be so heartless. It was clear that life was going to be even harder without my mother. John had never worked since he married my mother. His biggest passion was gambling, and he would disappear until late at night. When I came home from school, I went to the kitchen and opened the cupboard to find it completely empty. John had made the last of the pasta and consumed everything. At that moment, John walked in. I told you to find a job as soon as possible, he said sternly. Otherwise, we'll both starve. Ignoring the anger in my eyes, he continued. And as soon as you get paid, you'll bring every penny to me without spending a cent. Understood? I slowly nodded in agreement. At that moment, I realized once again how my life would turn into a living hell without my mother. I went to my room and started looking for job listings on the computer. A nearby hotel was looking for a cleaner. I immediately set out to apply there. The hotel owner, Mr. Smith, was a stern-looking man. You said you could work after school, right? He asked. Yes, that's right, I replied. I can work after school. I can only pay you half the salary, he said with a sly expression. I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. I accept, I said. I had no other choice. All right, said Mr. Smith, frowning. When you find any valuable or forgotten items left by the hotel guests, you'll bring them to me. Agreed? Agreed, I replied. While cleaning my first room at the hotel, I found a gold ring on the bed. It was probably left behind by a guest. As I held the ring in my hand to examine it, Mr. Smith suddenly entered the room. I told you to give me any valuable items you find in the rooms, he said harshly. Before I could respond, he took the ring from my hand and examined it. At least $500, he muttered. Mr. Smith, I said, aren't you going to return the ring to its owner? He turned to me, his eyes filled with anger. You mind your own business, he shouted. I was stunned. I realized that Mr. Smith didn't return the valuable items he found in the hotel rooms to their owners. This situation made me uncomfortable, but there was nothing I could do. I quietly left the room and continued my work. That week, I received my first paycheck. Although it was small, I managed to buy some groceries. When I got home and started preparing dinner, John came into the kitchen. His eyes were gleaming. I guess you got paid, he said, extending his hand to me. I took the remaining money out of my pocket and handed it to John. When he saw the money, he scoffed. Is this all? Unfortunately, I get half the salary because I work after school, I replied. John, with a look of dissatisfaction on his face, said, Then you'll have to quit school. Just as I was about to respond, the doorbell rang. John panicked. Go answer the door. If they ask for me, tell them I'm not home. When I opened the door, I was met by two large men in suits and sunglasses. Is John home? One of them asked. He's not home, I replied. The other man stepped closer to me. John owes us a gambling debt. Please make sure he calls us when he gets home, he said. I'll tell him when he comes back, I said. After they left, I realized how big Ali's gambling debts were. When I went to work after school, I was cleaning the rooms as usual. While walking down the hotel corridor, I saw two men in suits who had come to our house the day before. My heart started to race. I panicked, thinking they were looking for me, and quickly entered an empty hotel room. I immediately hid under the bed. After a while, no one came into the room. I took a deep breath and felt relieved. Just then, I noticed a large bag under the bed. Out of curiosity, I opened it and found it full of money. It was probably left behind by a previous guest, but I couldn't tell Mr. Smith about this. He would use the money for himself and not give a cent to the owner. I thought of Mike, who worked at the reception. Mike was also greedy like Mr. Smith, but I had no other choice if I wanted to return the money to its owner. I went to him and asked, Who stayed in the room 84 last night? Mike raised his eyebrows and said, I can't tell you that. With a mocking expression on his face, I took out $100 from my pocket and showed it to him. Will this help? I asked. His eyes lit up. He immediately checked his computer and gave me the name and phone number of the person who stayed in that room. I handed him the money. As Mike took the money, he asked, Why do you want this information so badly? It's a long story, Mike, I said, trying to brush him off. But thank you. Now I had a clue to find the owner of the bag. Returning this money to its rightful owner was important to me because I had to listen to my conscience. The only way to find the owner of the money was through the information Mike gave me. As I left the hotel, I tightly held the bag, covering it with my work clothes, which I was taking home to wash. Just as I was about to leave the reception, Mr. Smith appeared in front of me. I saw Mike smirking at the reception desk. He had definitely ratted me out. Mr. Smith, with an angry expression, said, "Well, Emily, you have quite a lot of belongings today." I turned to Mr. Smith and said determinedly, "Mr. Smith, I can tell you everything." Mr. Smith angrily shouted, "Give me that bag." I handed him the bag, and he immediately opened it on the table. When he saw the bag full of money, he practically jumped with joy. "I'm rich! I'm rich!" he shouted, just as the two men in suits who had confronted my stepfather entered the reception. The men turned to Mr. Smith and said, "Hey, Smith, since you're so rich now, it's time to pay your debts." Mr. Smith tightly held the bag, pretending it didn't contain money. "I don't have any money right now, but I'll pay you in the future, I promise," he tried to weasel out. One of the men pulled out his gun and pointed it at Mr. Smith. "The money in that bag is ours," he said angrily. I was very scared. My knees started to shake. At that moment, another man in a suit entered the reception with his bodyguards. This man was the rightful owner of the bag, and I'd called him after getting his number from Mike, explaining the situation. As soon as he entered, he said confidently, "It's all right, guys. My name is Robert, and the money is mine." Mr. Smith and the two men in suits looked at him in shock. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. Mr. Robert replied, "I stayed here last night and left my money under the bed." Mr. Smith, realizing the situation, immediately accepted the truth and said, "He's right." The two men in suits said, "But he told us he would pay his gambling debt to us with this money," turning to Mr. Robert. Mr. Robert turned to Mr. Smith and asked, "If I pay your debt to these men, will you give me the hotel?" Mr. Smith, realizing he was cornered, reluctantly agreed. Mr. Robert quickly pulled out a document and handed it to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith hesitantly signed the paper. It turned out that Mr. Robert was a kind-hearted stock market millionaire. Mr. Robert took the bag and handed it to the two men in suits. When they opened the bag and saw the money inside, they looked at each other with joy. There was a look of relief on their faces. At that moment, one of the men turned to me and said, "I think I know you." I was very embarrassed and couldn't say anything. Looking down, the other man, looking at me carefully, said, Yes, I recognize you. Your stepfather owes us money." Mr. Robert turned to them and asked, "How much is his debt?" The men replied, $20,000. Mr. Robert took out 2 stacks of money from his pocket and handed it to them. "They no longer have any debt. You can leave," he said. The two men in suits laughed and left the hotel. Mr. Robert turned to me and said, "You seem like a good person, Emily. Half of this hotel is now yours, and you will run it." I was so shocked that I didn't know what to say. "Thank you so much," I said, tears in my eyes. "Thank you for paying off my stepfather's gambling debt. But I will pay you back." Mr. Robert smiled kindly. "We'll get that debt from your stepfather," he said with a laugh. After school, I was now at the hotel I co-owned and started living there. My first task was to fire the snitch, Mike, from the reception. I didn't trust him and hired a friendlier, more reliable woman in his place. At the end of the month, I sent half of the hotel's earnings to Mr. Robert. This partnership played a significant role in maintaining the hotel's success. In case you're wondering about my stepfather, he now works at the hotel too. Since Mr. Robert paid off his gambling debt, he will be working as a valet for 10 years without pay to repay the debt. Moreover, he is not allowed inside the hotel. He has to wait outside the door for hours under the sun. This is his punishment for all he did to my mother over the years. Justice had finally been served. By the way, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Bye!